We move on to the topic now of sustainability in the energy sector. This is going to be quite interesting. The question we're going to be asking is, how can we drive decarbonisation? Joining me is Dagher. Good to have you along. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, your official title is President and CEO of Grid Solutions, GE Renewable Energy, across just a few markets, Middle East, Turkey and Africa. So I'm guessing pre-pandemic days you were doing a bit of travelling, which probably doesn't happen too much anymore.
So we've been having the luxury of working from home for the last year, which I enjoyed for at least some time, but now I'm really looking forward to start traveling again.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are looking forward to traveling again. So thank you very much for joining us and having your time this afternoon. The UAE has committed to climate change action by cutting emissions by a quarter. And that's no small amount by 2030. How does that vision fit in with the visions of GE?
Well, I mean, this topic has been out there for some time now. And probably the starting point that we all recall is in 1992, the Rio meeting, the Earth Summit, which was the start, I think, of all the global talks. However, back then, it was limited maybe to the burden sharing among rich nations. Later on, many meetings happened, but most recently was the Paris meeting, where really the biggest change was really to include all countries with real agenda, big commitments, with aspirational goals of limiting the impact to 2 degrees only. That's a very ambitious target, and subsequently an aspirational goal of limiting that temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. With an agenda of really having operational rigor every 5 years, all the countries committed to certain changes. And every 5 years, I think this year, there will be the first review after that meeting to check on the progress. UAE has been leading in that regard. And it was one of the 40 nations that were included in the President Biden's Leaders Summit around climate change. And UAE not only has committed to cutting the emissions by a quarter in 2030, but they've already put an energy strategy for the 2050. Which really transfers or aims to change the energy mix to at least 50% renewable energy, and at the same time cutting the demand. Because again, in MENA, we expect the population to grow by 50% in the region, demand to triple through the electrification. So the UAE is looking at the full equation, balancing the supply sources and the efficiency of the demand. Now, this fits really nicely with the GE vision and own values and the product offering and the technology. Because as a company, we also have embraced we pledged a carbon neutrality from our own operations by 2030. So we're already achieving the targets that we have for 2020. We've exceeded those targets and we are well on place. And then when you talk about the product portfolios that we offer, it's all in that energy transition space. Whether from optimizing the efficiency of the current assets, and if I want to look at it, we try to solve on 4 axes. It's about really the sustainability, affordability, accessibility, and resilience. So that's what we look at in GE. And we have a product portfolio, whether from onshore, offshore wind, hydro, nuclear, grid, to really partner with nations like UAE and help them with that journey to move into the targets, the ambitious target that they've put for themselves.
You make a great point for someone who's outside the industry. You hear about people wanting to reduce those emissions, but then you also have to factor into the growth in population where emissions are going to increase. So you're having to work doubly hard to reduce those. And on that rationale, what do you think is the rationale behind, I guess, the current drive for decarbonisation? You mentioned in 1992 there were agreements. But when it comes to in 2021, what is the rationale behind doing it? Is there a strategic imperative? And what do you think are the ways to support decarbonisation and energy transition, considering that oil and gas will continue to be the sources of energy to some degree in the short term?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned whether it's a strategic and important imperative. I mean, we've all heard the slogans about saving the planet and saving Earth. I mean, let's face it, the Earth has been there for 4 billion years, and it's probably going to continue for another 4 billion. What's really in question is which species is roaming the Earth during that time. And in reality, by taking action now, we're only saving ourselves. I don't know if it can be more strategic and demanding on all of us today. And if you look at the history of humankind, I mean, in the last 100 years, we've kind of consumed the oil reserves that we've had. So do we really want to be remembered as the generation that came to Earth, took all the resources and left it in a bad shape for the generations to come? And I think this should be an eye-opener for everybody and drive a lot of actions. Now, we understand that energy, you cannot flip the switch off today, stop all economic activity across all sectors, wait until we build renewable energy, and then flip the switch back on. It's a journey, it's a transition. So we need to live with what we have today. We have a lot of infrastructure that is put in place. How can we reduce the impact of that current infrastructure? How can we add to it more sustainable resources in terms of renewable energy? And how can we expand? So this is where we can look at the current transition. So today, as I said, any new built power plant, if possible, should be from a renewable source. And we already see that, according to Bloomberg, in the next 30 years, 80% of the new power plants will in fact be leveraging renewable energy sources. However, the base load will continue to be on gas, and these gas and coal. So how can we really reduce the emissions of the current gas? By doing upgrades, by moving simple cycle power plants to combined cycle, you get 50% more efficiency. Right? By putting advanced parts in the hot gas path and gas turbines, you can also improve the efficiency. So we need to work with the assets that still have useful life in them while we build up our network and adding more renewable sources. And that's the journey until the 2050 target of carbon neutrality globally.
On those renewable energy sources, one I wanted to ask you on is hydrogen. What do you think is your view on leveraging hydrogen as a clean energy source? Do you see it being, you see renewables as being part of the mix? I mean, you mentioned before that whilst we want to go into renewables, there's still going to have to be a base load there of coal and of gas. But is 100% renewable really possible?
Well, it's going to be an energy mix. And look, you've mentioned hydrogen. But I would expand it a little bit about the energy storage. Today, when you turn on the lights, electricity has to be always balanced. Demand and supply has to be balanced. Somewhere the same power that you're consuming has to be produced instantly. Right? With renewable sources, that's very unpredictable. You don't know if a cloud's going to pass over a solar field. You don't know if the wind's going to blow to the right intensity at that time. So you really need a mechanism of storing energy that will actually reduce that fluctuation. Until we have giant batteries, and obviously the technology is going there, we have seen a lot of efforts of storing energy, whether in pumped water, molten salt, compressed air in tanks, right? So we have many technologies to store that energy, that surplus that comes from renewable energy, and then use it on demand when you need it. So hydrogen is an effective way of doing just that, right? So you're taking the excess of renewable energy, and hydrogen has many colors. Probably the color just is a notion. You've heard about green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, pink, yellow, and it depends on how do you produce that hydrogen, whether purely from renewable energy, from solar only, nuclear, or from actually still CO2 generating processes. Nonetheless, hydrogen, if used, the green hydrogen, coming from surplus renewable energy, can be stored, can be transported, and can be, in fact, the biggest usage is on the industries that have not been electrified yet. We've heard earlier that electrification journey from the panel before, that electrification is a key enabler of that sustainability. So we really need more industries to be electrified. However, for those that are not electrified, the usage of fuels and the means of storage as a battery source really is important. From a GE perspective, we can run gas turbines on the hydrogen fuel, which will, if you run 100% on hydrogen, you decrease your emissions by 99%. So you're using the same gas turbines that can be used for base load that will help you and with zero impact on the environment. So that's the power of having that fuel. And especially if it's a green hydrogen, then it's really coming from renewable sources. And therefore, even in the production of that hydrogen, you do not have an impact on the environment. And we have an example here in the UAE, like ADNOC is already producing. Now, they're producing blue hydrogen as a byproduct of their facilities. But nonetheless, with the blue hydrogen, you're still capturing the CO2 and not releasing it to the environment. And that's a very good initiative in the UAE here.
Yeah, and it's great. And one of the things about the UAE, that you mentioned is that they do have these clean energy goals. But in your role, I mean, you're the president and CEO of the GE Renewable Energy. What do you think are the other enablers? A lot of our panelists have spoken about in the healthcare sector the importance of enablers. What are the other enablers that are used to promote decarbonisation, you think, that are going to help achieve the UAE's clean energy goals?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way I think about it is really in three main pillars, if not four. Initially is avoid producing more CO2, right? So avoid. In case you cannot avoid, reduce, right? And if you cannot reduce, capture. I mentioned earlier the blue hydrogen, that when you capture the CO2 emissions, and we have a lot of, I mean, today we have more than 20 global scale carbon capture projects, another 40 are in place. So we really can capture that CO2 that we cannot avoid or reduce, right? So that's a very important part. But more important is also the hybrid industries, because today, as I said, we're going to all live with a certain mix of energy. And unless we have the controls to balance between the various sources of energy and keep them matching the demand, making sure they're accessible to the people, that equation or adoption of renewable is going to always be the challenge. The other aspect is, again, I think the previous panel talked about the economic sustainability. And today what we see is that renewable energy is at grid parity. It became economically sustainable to only, without any subsidies from the government, because governments can do so much for a limited period. However, today we've already achieved the grid parity on renewable energy. But moving on to better enablers, again, I mean, when we talk about, and I'm going to take a different look here, when we talk about plans of 2050, most likely none of us here in this room will be actively in the workplace at that time to see those results. What really matters is the next generation. We really need to, and I mentioned the three pillars, avoid and reduce and capture, but first of all is really commit and embrace. And you do this by making sure that the next generation, like my kids at school, are growing up with that mindset, coming with that urge of making a change, really including environmental and climate challenges in their curriculum in school, making sure, I mean, look at COVID, what it did. If we can do to the environment change, and climate change, we give the same intensity that we did in 1 year for COVID. Today, everybody talks about COVID. Everybody understands what they need to do. Everybody knows that they need to do social distancing, wear masks, right? This is really a key thing. Can we elevate the climate change to become as urgent on everybody's mind, especially the younger generation, for them when they become the next leaders of the future and the next politicians, so that they will make sure they see our plans for 2050 coming to fruition?
Yeah, it's a great lesson, isn't it, about how kids can adapt so quickly and how their vision of change is so different to ours. But also, you're right about COVID. How can we, it'd be a great thing if we could bottle, how can we get humans to change their habits so quickly the way they did with COVID-19? If only we could work out how to do that, would be, we'd be solving a lot of problems. We're just running out of time, so one last question for you, Bernard. How do you see digitisation and smart grids in supporting energy transition?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, look, it's good to have renewable sources, right? And it's good to drive electrification of industries. But if you don't connect the load and the supply to each other, then you're not getting anything. So today the grid voted the biggest invention of the whole century, by the way, and the most complex machine. I mean, if you think about it, without the grid, there is nothing. There is no computers, no internet. And it is, in fact, but it's very complex, and it evolved organically. It was not designed from a blank sheet of paper. So that's why the complexity. And today the grid has been designed with a central source of power and unidirectional flow to a load that is using it. With today's, it's called the prosumers. Like, everybody can be actually consuming and generating power. You can have solar panels on your rooftop. Nobody knows with the EVs where you're going to be charging them. So the dynamic nature of the next generation grid requires, first of all, expansion of the grid assets themselves. It requires a new thinking altogether of how you ensure grid resilience and how do you ensure the capacity of dealing with that change in demand and the nature of load and all this intermittency in power. And you need a lot of digital tools, whether you're talking about asset performance management, whether online monitoring, whether load dispatchability. So you need a lot of digital tools to control and be the brain that allows that energy transition to happen. So grid will be always the enabler that connects all the various power generation assets to the various loads and that we are expanding and eventually will help us achieve those goals.
Hearing your passion, it's no surprise you've ended up as the President and CEO of Grid Solutions. Shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. You've done very well. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's been another great discussion. So thank you to Bernard Dagher, President and CEO of Grid Solutions, GE Renewable Energy across the Middle East, Turkey and Africa. In just a moment, our next panel is going to be focusing on energy, maritime and sustainability. So another panel coming up very soon. Thank you very much.